Lieutenant Commander Sarah Matthews sat quietly in the back corner of the briefing room, her flight suit pressed and her hair pulled back in regulation style. The room buzzed with the low murmur of conversations between elite Navy SEALs, their voices carrying the weight of men who had seen combat in the most dangerous corners of the world. She was the only woman in a room filled with 47 special operations warriors, but she had learned long ago not to let that fact intimidate her. The air conditioning hummed overhead, fighting against the oppressive heat of the Naval Special Warfare Command facility in Virginia Beach. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training compound, where these same men had pushed their bodies and minds to the absolute limit. Inside this windowless room, maps covered every available wall space, showing satellite imagery of hostile territory thousands of miles away. Sarah had been called to this briefing somewhat unexpectedly. Her squadron commander had simply told her that morning to report to Building 12 at 1,500 hours, wearing her flight suit and bringing her logbook. No explanation, no details, just orders. As a helicopter pilot with over 8 years of service and multiple combat deployments, she was used to sudden changes in plans. But this felt different somehow. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate attention without him having to say a word. At 6'2", with graying hair and scars that spoke of battles fought in places most people could never pronounce, he embodied everything the public imagined when they thought of Navy SEALs. His reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Morrison had led successful missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and half a dozen other countries where American forces operated in the shadows. The briefing had been going on for 20 minutes when Morrison paused mid-sentence and looked around the room with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to assess every situation for potential advantages. The mission he was describing was complex and dangerous, requiring insertion deep into enemy territory to extract a high-value intelligence asset. The window for success was narrow, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Sarah found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the tactical details despite not knowing why she was there. The target location was a compound situated in mountainous terrain, surrounded by hostile forces and protected by sophisticated anti-aircraft systems. Getting in would be challenging enough, but getting out with an additional person would require exceptional skill and probably a good deal of luck. Morrison clicked to the next slide, showing aerial reconnaissance photos of the target area. The compound sat on a rocky plateau, accessible by road from only one direction. The surrounding peaks rose several thousand feet above sea level, creating natural barriers that would funnel any approaching aircraft through predictable flight paths. It was exactly the kind of tactical nightmare that required creative solutions and flawless execution. The plan Morrison outlined called for a multi-phase approach. Ground teams would establish overwatch positions on the surrounding ridgelines, providing security and communications relay. The extraction team would fast rope into the compound under cover of darkness, secure the asset, and then move to a designated landing zone for pickup. Simple in concept, but the devil was always in the details. Sarah studied the topographical maps displayed on the screen, her pilot's mind automatically calculating approach angles, fuel requirements, and escape routes. The terrain was unforgiving, with sudden elevation changes and unpredictable wind patterns that could turn a routine flight into a deadly challenge. Whoever flew this mission would need intimate knowledge of mountain flying techniques and the ability to operate in brownout conditions where dust and debris could eliminate visibility in seconds. The asset they were extracting was a local intelligence operative who had been providing critical information about enemy troop movements and planned attacks against American forces. His cover had been blown 3 days earlier, and hostile forces were actively hunting for him. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of getting him out alive, but rushing the mission without proper preparation would likely result in casualties among the rescue team. Morrison continued his briefing, detailing the specific challenges they faced. The compound was located in a valley that experienced severe crosswinds during certain times of day. The altitude and temperature conditions would affect aircraft performance, requiring precise calculations for weight and balance. Most critically, the anti-aircraft threat was substantial and mobile, meaning that any helicopter approaching the area would be flying into a potentially deadly gauntlet. The room remained silent as Morrison explained that their usual helicopter support was unavailable due to maintenance issues and competing mission requirements. Two of their regular pilots were recovering from injuries sustained in a training accident the previous week. Another was deployed to a classified location that prevented his participation in this operation. The remaining pilots in their normal rotation lacked the specific mountain flying experience that this mission demanded. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand why she might have been called to this briefing. Her background included extensive mountain flying training, gained during deployments to Afghanistan, where she had flown countless missions into similar terrain. She had logged over 2,000 hours in combat zones, much of it in conditions that would challenge the most experienced pilots. Her record included several successful extractions under fire, including one mission where she had landed her helicopter in a hot landing zone to evacuate wounded soldiers while taking direct enemy fire. Morrison paused and looked directly at the assembled SEALs. His voice carried the weight of command as he addressed the elephant in the room that everyone had been thinking about, but nobody had yet spoken aloud. The success of this mission hinged entirely on finding a pilot willing and able to fly into what amounted to a carefully planned trap. Knowing that the margin for error was essentially zero, the captain's next words would change everything. He straightened his shoulders and looked around the room, making eye contact with several of his most experienced operators. These men had volunteered for the most dangerous missions the military had to offer, but this operation was pushing the boundaries of acceptable risk even by their standards. The pilot they needed would have to possess not just technical skill, but also the mental fortitude to function under extreme pressure, while surrounded by people whose lives depended entirely on their decisions. Sarah could feel the tension in the room as Morrison prepared to speak. Every person present understood that they were discussing a mission that could easily result in multiple casualties if anything went wrong. The helicopter would be flying into known anti-aircraft coverage with minimal support, carrying a full load of special operations personnel, and attempting to land in a confined area under combat conditions. It was exactly the kind of operation that military planners tried to avoid unless absolutely necessary. The intelligence asset they were risking everything to extract had already provided information that prevented 3 separate attacks against American forces. His continued access to enemy leadership could potentially save dozens of American lives in the coming months. The decision to launch this mission had been made at the highest levels of command, but the responsibility for executing it fell to the people in this room. Morrison took a deep breath and surveyed the room one final time before speaking the words that would define the next phase of the operation. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Outside, the sounds of ongoing training exercises could be heard faintly through the walls, a reminder that the preparation for war never stopped, even when planning the most dangerous missions. Finally, Morrison broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of their predicament. His voice was steady but carried an undertone that suggested he already knew how difficult it would be to find someone willing to accept this level of risk. The mission timeline was accelerating, and they needed an answer quickly. Delay would only increase the danger to the asset they were trying to extract and reduce their chances of success. The captain's question hung in the air like a challenge, waiting for someone brave enough or skilled enough to accept what amounted to a suicide mission disguised as a routine extraction. Every pilot in the Navy had trained for moments like this, but training and reality were two completely different things. This was the moment when theoretical knowledge met actual warfare, and the consequences of failure would be measured in human lives rather than training scores. Sarah felt every eye in the room scanning the faces around them, looking for someone to step forward and volunteer for what could very well be a one-way mission. The silence grew uncomfortable as seconds ticked by without anyone responding. These were men who had never backed down from a fight, but even they understood the difference between calculated risk and reckless endangerment. The pilot who volunteered for this mission would need to possess something beyond normal courage. In that moment of absolute quiet, Sarah made the decision that would define not just this mission, but the rest of her career. She had not spoken a word during the entire briefing, content to listen and learn while surrounded by men whose reputation for toughness was legendary. But now, as Morrison's question echoed in the silence, she realized that her years of training and experience had led to this exact moment. Slowly, deliberately, and with the confidence that came from knowing she was probably the most qualified pilot in the room for this specific mission, Sarah Matthews rose from her chair in the back corner. The sound of her movement was barely audible, but in the absolute silence of the briefing room, it might as well have been thunder. Every head in the room turned toward her as she stood at attention, her decision made, and her commitment absolute. The silence that followed Sarah's movement was deafening. 47 pairs of eyes stared at her with expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism to outright disbelief. She stood perfectly straight, her hands at her sides, waiting for Captain Morrison's response. The air in the room seemed to thicken as everyone processed what had just happened. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. He had seen enough combat to know that courage came in many forms, and he had learned never to judge a warrior by their appearance. Still, the woman standing before him was volunteering for a mission that would test the limits of even the most experienced combat pilots. He needed to be absolutely certain she understood what she was committing to. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice respectful but probing, "this isn't a training exercise. We're talking about flying into a hot zone with confirmed anti-aircraft threats, unpredictable weather patterns, and terrain that has claimed aircraft before. The asset extraction point is in a valley where the winds can shift without warning, and there's no guarantee we'll be able to provide adequate air support if things go sideways." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Sir, I've read the mission parameters. I've flown 43 combat missions in similar terrain in Afghanistan, including 7 extractions under fire. I'm current on all mountain flying certifications, and I've logged more high-altitude combat hours than any other pilot currently available to your unit. I understand the risks, and I accept them." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the SEALs exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their surprise at her credentials. Others maintained their poker faces, waiting to see how Morrison would respond. The captain studied Sarah for a long moment, his experienced eye taking in details that others might miss. Her posture spoke of confidence without arrogance. Her voice carried conviction without bravado. Most importantly, her eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had already seen combat and understood its realities. "What aircraft are you qualified in?" "Lieutenant Commander?" Morrison asked, pulling out a folder that Sarah assumed contained her personnel file. "Sir, I'm pilot in command qualified on the MH-60 Seahawk, with over 2,000 hours total time and 800 hours in combat zones. I hold instructor ratings for both basic and advanced mountain flying techniques. My last deployment included operations at altitudes up to 12,000 feet, in conditions similar to your target area." Sarah's response was crisp and professional. Delivered without hesitation or doubt, Morrison opened her file and scanned the contents. What he saw there clearly impressed him, based on the slight nod he gave as he read. Her record included commendations for exceptional performance under fire, multiple successful missions in adverse conditions, and evaluations that consistently rated her as one of the top pilots in her squadron. More importantly, her experience included exactly the kind of high-risk extractions that this mission would require. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Morrison's senior enlisted advisor, leaned forward in his chair. Rodriguez had been with SEAL teams for over 20 years, and his opinion carried significant weight with everyone in the room. "Ma'am, with all due respect, flying with SEALs is different from regular aviation missions. We push aircraft to their limits and beyond. We ask pilots to do things that probably violate several regulations. Can you handle that kind of pressure?" Sarah turned to face Rodriguez directly. "Master Chief, during my last deployment, I flew a damaged helicopter with hydraulic failure and partial engine failure into a landing zone that was under direct mortar fire to extract a wounded reconnaissance team. The landing zone was at 9,500 feet, surrounded by peaks that required a spiral descent through enemy fire to reach safely. All 6 team members made it home alive. I can handle pressure." The room fell silent again. But this time the quality of the silence was different. The skeptical looks were being replaced by expressions of grudging respect. These men had all been in situations where their lives depended entirely on the skill and courage of others, and they recognized authentic experience when they heard it. Captain Morrison closed the file and looked around the room before addressing his team. "Gentlemen, Lieutenant Commander Matthews has the qualifications we need for this mission. Unless someone has specific concerns about her ability to complete the operation successfully, I'm prepared to accept her volunteer status. He paused and looked directly at Sarah. Ma'am, are you absolutely certain you want to take this on? Once we begin mission planning, you're committed until completion. Sarah's response came without hesitation. Yes, sir. I'm committed. Morrison nodded and moved to the next phase of the briefing. All right then. Let's get into the specific details. Matthews, you'll need to work closely with our mission planners to develop flight paths that minimize exposure to known threats while still allowing us to reach our objectives. The asset is located in a compound that sits at approximately 8,000 feet elevation. The surrounding peaks reach up to 12,000 feet, which means you'll be flying through mountain passes with minimal maneuvering room. For the next 2 hours, Sarah found herself immersed in the most detailed mission planning session of her career. The SEALs approached tactical planning with an intensity and thoroughness that impressed even her experienced perspective. Every possible contingency was discussed, analyzed, and planned for. Backup plans had backup plans, and those had contingencies of their own. The target compound was located in a region where weather patterns could change rapidly and without warning. Morning fog was common, which could provide concealment but also create navigation hazards. Afternoon thunderstorms were frequent during this time of year, bringing dangerous downdrafts and severe turbulence. Wind patterns in the valley were unpredictable, affected by the surrounding terrain in ways that could turn a routine landing into a dangerous emergency. Lieutenant Jake Stevens, the team's communications specialist, spread detailed topographical maps across the conference table. Ma'am, these peaks create wind shear conditions that change by the hour. We've got weather data going back 6 months, but Mother Nature doesn't always follow the forecast. You'll need to be prepared for sudden changes in wind direction and velocity that could affect your approach and departure routes. Sarah studied the maps carefully, her pilot's mind automatically calculating angles and distances. What's the latest intelligence on enemy anti-aircraft assets in the area? Are we talking about shoulder-fired missiles, or do they have more sophisticated systems? Petty Officer First Class Mitchell, the team's intelligence specialist, answered her question with the kind of detail that came from hard-won experience. Intelligence indicates they have at least 3 mobile SA-7 systems, plus an unknown number of shoulder-fired missiles. The mobile systems are the real threat because they can reposition quickly, and we might not have current location data when you make your approach. The SA-7 systems were Soviet-designed surface-to-air missiles that could engage aircraft at ranges up to several miles. More critically, they were mobile and could be repositioned quickly, making it impossible to predict exactly where the threat would be located during the actual mission. The shoulder-fired missiles had shorter range but were easier to conceal and could be fired from positions that were difficult to detect in advance. Chief Warrant Officer Williams, the team's senior explosives expert, added another layer of complexity to the tactical picture. The compound itself is built into the side of a cliff face, which limits approach routes but also provides some protection from ground fire once you're in the landing zone. The problem is getting there. You'll have to fly through at least 2 kilometers of open valley where you'll be exposed to fire from multiple directions. Sarah absorbed all of this information while simultaneously running calculations in her head. The helicopter would be heavily loaded with fuel, personnel, and equipment, which would affect its performance at high altitude. The thin air at 8,000 feet would reduce engine efficiency and rotor effectiveness, requiring careful power management throughout the flight. Add in the threat environment and challenging terrain, and this mission was pushing the boundaries of what was possible with available technology. Morrison pulled out a satellite photograph that showed the target area in high resolution. This image was taken 3 days ago, which means the tactical situation could have changed significantly by the time we arrive. The asset is being held in this building here. He pointed to a structure near the center of the compound, but we won't know his exact location until we're on the ground. The building Morrison indicated was a 2-story structure that appeared to be the main administrative facility for the compound. Getting the asset from there to the helicopter landing zone would require the extraction team to move approximately 200 meters across open ground, while potentially under fire. The helicopter would need to remain on the ground or in a hover for several minutes while the team completed their mission, making it vulnerable to enemy fire. Sergeant First Class Martinez, the team medic, raised a concern that highlighted another dimension of the mission's complexity. Ma'am, We need to plan for the possibility of casualties during the extraction. If someone gets hit, we might need additional time on the ground for medical treatment before we can move. Can your bird handle extended operations in a hot landing zone? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. The MH-60 was designed for exactly these kinds of missions, but every situation was unique. The helicopter can maintain position in a hover for extended periods if necessary, but fuel consumption increases significantly. We'll need to calculate our fuel requirements based on worst-case scenarios, which means we might be operating with minimal reserves by the time we reach the extraction point. The fuel calculations were particularly critical because the mission profile required flying to the target area, potentially waiting in a holding pattern while the ground team completed their mission, and then flying back to friendly territory. All of this would be done at high altitude in potentially adverse weather conditions, both of which increased fuel consumption beyond normal planning factors. Captain Morrison looked around the room at his assembled team. I want everyone to understand that this mission is voluntary for all participants. The risks are substantial, and I won't order anyone to participate who has concerns about the plan or their ability to execute it successfully. He paused and looked at each person individually. That said, we have an American citizen whose life depends on us getting this right. The room remained quiet as each team member considered Morrison's words. These were men who had volunteered for special operations duty knowing that it would involve exactly these kinds of missions. The risks were part of the job, but that didn't make them any less real. Lives would be on the line, and failure could mean death for multiple people. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. As the pilot, she would be responsible for getting the team to the target and bringing them home safely. Every decision she made during the flight could affect the outcome of the mission and the lives of everyone aboard. It was a responsibility she had carried before, but it never became routine or easy. Over the next week, Sarah immersed herself in mission preparation with an intensity that surprised even the SEALs. She studied weather patterns, memorized terrain features, and practiced emergency procedures until they became second nature. She flew simulator missions that recreated the exact conditions they expected to encounter, pushing herself and the aircraft to their limits in a safe environment. The helicopter assigned to the mission was carefully inspected and modified to optimize it for the specific requirements they faced. Additional fuel tanks were installed to extend range and loiter time. Defensive systems were checked and rechecked to ensure they would function properly if needed. Every component was tested to military specifications and beyond. Morrison watched Sarah's preparation with growing confidence in his decision to accept her volunteer status. She approached the mission with exactly the kind of professional competence and attention to detail that separated exceptional pilots from merely good ones. More importantly, she demonstrated the ability to work seamlessly with his team, adapting to their procedures and requirements without losing sight of her own responsibilities. The final mission briefing took place 36 hours before the scheduled launch time. Every detail had been rehearsed, every contingency planned for, and every team member had demonstrated proficiency in their assigned role. Sarah sat in the same corner where she had first heard about the mission, but now she was an integral part of the team rather than an observer. Morrison addressed the assembled team with the gravity that the situation deserved. We launch tomorrow night at 2,100 hours. Weather forecast shows clear conditions with light winds, which should give us optimal flying conditions for the approach. Intelligence reports no significant changes in enemy positions or capabilities. Questions? Sarah raised her hand. Sir, I'd like to request permission to fly a reconnaissance route this afternoon to verify wind conditions in the target area. The weather data is helpful, but I'd feel more confident with first-hand knowledge of the actual conditions we'll face. Morrison considered her request. It made tactical sense to gather as much current information as possible, but it also involved additional risk if the reconnaissance flight was detected. After a moment's thought, he nodded. Approved. But stay well outside the threat envelope. We can't afford to compromise the mission because of premature detection. As the team dispersed to make final preparations, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that she recognized from previous combat missions. The planning phase was complete, and now everything depended on execution. Tomorrow night, She would fly into enemy territory carrying some of the most elite warriors in the American military, and all of their lives would depend on her ability to perform under pressure. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, reviewing maps and procedures one final time. She had called her family earlier to let them know she would be out of communication for a few days, without revealing any details about the mission. It was a conversation she had made many times before, but it never became easier. The weight of tomorrow's mission pressed down on her as she tried to sleep. In 18 hours, she would be flying through mountain passes under combat conditions, carrying men whose courage and skill were legendary. The success or failure of the mission would be determined in large part by her decisions and her ability to handle an aircraft under the most challenging conditions imaginable. But she was ready. Years of training and experience had led to this moment, and she was determined not to let her team down. Tomorrow night, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Matthews would prove that courage and skill were not determined by gender, but by character and competence. The mission ahead would test both, but she was confident in her abilities and her commitment to bringing everyone home safely. The rotor blades of the MH-60 Seahawk cut through the night air with a rhythmic thrum that Sarah felt in her bones. 2300 hours local time, and they were 40 minutes out from the target. The helicopter flew dark, running lights extinguished, navigating through mountain passes using night vision and terrain-following radar. Inside the cabin, 8 Navy SEALs sat in focused silence, each man mentally rehearsing his role in the operation that would begin in less than an hour. Sarah's hands moved smoothly across the controls, making constant minor adjustments to maintain their planned flight path through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain pilots during daylight hours. Flying at night made everything exponentially more difficult, but it also provided the concealment necessary to reach their target undetected. The green glow of her night vision goggles painted the world in an eerie monochrome that transformed familiar landscapes into alien terrain. Co-pilot Lieutenant Brad Chen monitored their navigation systems while maintaining communication with overhead surveillance assets. Overwatch reports no change in enemy positions, he reported quietly through the intercom. Target area remains consistent with intelligence estimates. Chen was an experienced combat pilot in his own right, but he readily acknowledged Sarah's superior mountain flying skills and deferred to her judgment on flight path decisions. The route they were flying had been carefully planned to avoid known anti-aircraft positions while using terrain features for concealment. They flew through valleys and behind ridgelines whenever possible, popping up only briefly to verify their position before dropping back down to terrain-masking altitude. It was exhausting flying that required absolute concentration, but it was keeping them alive and undetected. Captain Morrison's voice came through the intercom from the cabin. "Pilot, we're approaching the final checkpoint. How are conditions looking for the approach to the target?" His calm tone betrayed none of the tension he must have been feeling as they closed in on the most dangerous part of the mission. Sarah checked her instruments and scanned the terrain ahead through her night vision equipment. Winds are currently light and variable, consistent with forecast. No unusual weather activity detected. We're on schedule and on course for the planned approach route. She paused to navigate around a communications tower that appeared suddenly in her field of view. Fuel consumption is within expected parameters. We're good to proceed. The final 30 minutes of the flight would take them through the most challenging terrain of the entire route. They would need to climb to nearly 10,000 feet to clear a mountain ridge, then descend rapidly into the target valley, while avoiding detection by enemy forces known to be operating in the area. The margin for error was minimal, and there would be no opportunity for a second attempt if something went wrong. As they approached the ridge that separated them from their target, Sarah felt the helicopter begin to struggle in the thin mountain air. At this altitude, the engines were producing less power, while the rotors were generating less lift. She adjusted her collective and cyclic inputs to compensate for the reduced performance, drawing on years of experience flying in similar conditions. Every control movement had to be precise and deliberate. "Coming up on the ridge crossing," Sarah announced. "Stand by for rapid descent on the other side." The plan called for them to pop up over the ridge just long enough to identify their descent route into the valley, then drop quickly to avoid presenting a target against the skyline. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing and coordination. The helicopter climbed steadily toward the ridge, its engines straining against the thin air and the weight of fuel, personnel, and equipment. Sarah watched her engine instruments carefully, ready to abort the mission if any parameters exceeded safe limits. High-altitude operations pushed every system to its maximum capability, and mechanical failure at this point would be catastrophic. They crested the ridge with barely 50 feet of clearance, and suddenly the target valley spread out below them. Sarah immediately pushed the cyclic forward and lowered the collective, beginning a controlled descent that would bring them to their planned approach altitude. The lights of the compound were visible in the distance, looking deceptively peaceful through the green glow of night vision equipment. Target in sight, Chen reported. Range approximately 15 kilometers. No obvious anti-aircraft activity detected. The compound appeared quiet, with only a few lights visible in windows scattered throughout the facility. If enemy forces were present, they were maintaining light discipline and avoiding any activity that might reveal their positions. Sarah leveled the helicopter at their planned approach altitude and began following the valley floor toward their destination. The terrain on both sides rose sharply, creating a natural corridor that would funnel them toward the compound while simultaneously limiting their maneuvering options. If they encountered hostile fire, their ability to take evasive action would be severely constrained by the surrounding mountains. 5 minutes to target, Morrison announced to his team. Final equipment checks, gentlemen. The SEALs began their final preparations, checking weapons, communications gear, and mission-essential equipment. Each man had rehearsed these procedures dozens of times, but combat operations left no room for assumptions or shortcuts. Sarah's attention was focused entirely on flying the aircraft through increasingly challenging terrain when Chen's urgent voice cut through the intercom. Contact! Surface-to-air missile launch detected, bearing 270, range approximately 3 kilometers. The threat warning system erupted in a cacophony of audio alerts as sophisticated electronics detected the infrared signature of an incoming missile. Without hesitation, Sarah threw the helicopter into a violent, evasive maneuver, pulling maximum G-forces as she simultaneously deployed countermeasures and dove toward the valley floor. The missile shot past their previous position, its proximity close enough that the heat signature was visible through their night vision equipment. The helicopter shuddered under the stress of the evasive maneuver, but held together. Missile evaded, Chen reported, his voice tight with adrenaline. Threat system shows multiple additional contacts in the area. They're definitely aware of our presence now. The element of surprise was gone, but they were committed to the mission. The asset's life depended on their success, and abort was not an option unless the situation became completely untenable. Morrison's voice remained calm, despite the dramatic change in circumstances. Continue to target. We're going in hot, but we're still going in. The decision to proceed was his to make, and he had made it without hesitation. His team was prepared for exactly this kind of situation, and they would adapt their tactics to match the threat level. Sarah continued flying toward the compound while monitoring multiple threat indicators and maintaining situational awareness of the rapidly evolving tactical situation. 2 more missiles were launched during their approach, but her evasive flying and the helicopter's countermeasures defeated both attempts. The anti-aircraft gunners were clearly having difficulty tracking a target that was maneuvering aggressively through complex terrain. The landing zone came into view as they rounded the final approach waypoint. It was a small clearing adjacent to the main compound, barely large enough for the helicopter but offering the shortest possible distance for the extraction team to move the asset. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from small arms fire around the compound perimeter, indicating that ground combat was already underway. Landing zone in sight, Sarah reported. Multiple hostiles visible around the compound. Ground fire increasing. Tracer rounds were beginning to streak past the helicopter as enemy fighters opened fire with automatic weapons. The distinctive green glow of tracer ammunition created deadly light shows against the dark background of the mountains. We're going in, Morrison declared. Pilot, get us on the ground. We'll secure the area and extract the asset. The SEALs in the cabin were already preparing to fast rope into the landing zone, their equipment checked and their weapons ready for immediate action upon landing. Sarah brought the helicopter into the landing zone using every bit of skill she had developed during years of combat flying. Enemy fire was increasing in intensity and accuracy as she flared to arrest their forward speed. and began the final descent. Bullets struck the aircraft's armor plating with metallic impacts that could be felt as much as heard. The helicopter's defensive systems were engaging targets automatically, returning fire at detected threats. The aircraft touched down in a cloud of dust and debris kicked up by the rotor wash. Before the wheels had fully settled, Morrison and his team were out of the cabin and moving toward their objective. On the ground, moving to target. Morrison's voice was barely audible over the sound of gunfire and rotor noise. Sarah maintained the helicopter in a hover, ready to move quickly if the tactical situation required immediate repositioning. Chen monitored their fuel status and defensive systems while maintaining communication with the extraction team. Team Alpha is approaching the target building, he reported. Resistance is heavier than expected, but they're making progress. The minutes stretched endlessly as Sarah held position in the landing zone while combat raged around her. Enemy forces were converging on their location from multiple directions, and the intensity of incoming fire was steadily increasing. Several rounds struck the cockpit area, spider-webbing the armored glass but not penetrating into the crew compartment. Taking heavy fire from multiple directions, Sarah reported. Aircraft is holding together, but we can't maintain this position indefinitely. Fuel consumption was higher than planned due to the extended hover operations, and battle damage was beginning to affect some of the helicopter's systems. They needed to complete the extraction quickly before their situation became critical. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with an edge of urgency. We've got the asset, but he's wounded. Need medical assistance immediately upon extraction. The mission was succeeding, but complications were mounting. A wounded extraction subject would slow their movement and potentially require medical attention during the flight back to friendly territory. Roger, medical team standing by. Chen responded while coordinating with the aircraft's medical specialist. The helicopter was equipped with basic medical supplies and personnel trained in combat first aid, but serious injuries would require evacuation to a proper medical facility as quickly as possible. Sarah watched through her night vision as Morrison's team emerged from the compound carrying a figure between them. The asset appeared to be conscious but unable to walk unassisted. The extraction team moved as quickly as possible across the open ground between the building and the helicopter, but their progress was slowed by the need to support their injured charge. Enemy fire intensified as hostile forces recognized what was happening. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows and rooftop positions throughout the compound, as every available weapon was brought to bear on the extraction team. Sarah could see the green traces of incoming rounds bracketing the moving figures as they struggled across the deadly open ground. 30 seconds out, Morrison shouted over the radio. Stand by for immediate departure. The team was almost to the aircraft. But those final 30 seconds felt like an eternity, as enemy fire reached a crescendo of violence and desperation. Sarah prepared the helicopter for immediate takeoff, running through her mental checklist while maintaining visual contact with the approaching team. Every system needed to be ready for maximum performance the moment her passengers were aboard. There would be no time for deliberate preparations once the extraction began. The extraction team reached the helicopter and quickly loaded the wounded asset into the cabin. Morrison was the last man aboard, providing covering fire until the final second. All aboard! Go! 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 He shouted as he dove through the cabin door. Sarah pulled pitch, and the helicopter leaped into the air, climbing rapidly away from the landing zone as enemy fire reached its peak intensity. Tracers filled the air around them like deadly fireworks, but the aircraft's speed and Sarah's evasive flying carried them clear of the most concentrated fire. The sound of bullets striking the fuselage gradually faded as they gained altitude and distance, clear of the immediate threat area, Sarah reported as they climbed toward their planned departure route. Aircraft systems appear to be functioning normally despite battle damage. Fuel remaining adequate for return flight. The adrenaline of combat was beginning to fade, replaced by the focused concentration required for the long flight back to friendly territory. Chen was already coordinating with medical facilities at their destination base, while monitoring the helicopter's various systems for signs of battle damage that might affect their ability to complete the flight safely. Medical team is standing by at home base, he reported. ETA approximately 90 minutes based on current fuel consumption and routing. The wounded asset was stable but required immediate medical attention upon landing. The extraction team's medic was providing what care he could in the confines of the helicopter cabin, but the aircraft's medical capabilities were limited. Getting him to a proper medical facility quickly was now their primary concern. Morrison appeared in the cockpit doorway, his face grim but satisfied. "Outstanding flying, Matthews," he said simply. "You got us in, and you got us out. The asset has intelligence that's going to save American lives." Coming from a man of Morrison's reputation and experience, the compliment meant more than any formal commendation could. The return flight passed without major incident, though Sarah remained alert for any signs of pursuit or additional threats. They flew a different route than their inbound track, avoiding areas where enemy forces might have repositioned to intercept their withdrawal. The helicopter performed flawlessly despite the battle damage, a testament to both the aircraft's robust design and the careful maintenance it had received. They landed at their home base 87 minutes after departing the target area. Medical personnel were waiting with an ambulance, and the wounded asset was transferred to their care within minutes of touchdown. The extraction had been successful, though not without cost in terms of risk and resources expended. In the debriefing that followed, Sarah's performance was universally praised by the SEALs who had trusted their lives to her skill. Her ability to evade multiple missile attacks while maintaining the mission timeline had been critical to their success. Her precise flying in challenging conditions had enabled the extraction team to reach their objective and return safely with their charge. Captain Morrison's after-action report would specifically commend Sarah's professionalism and competence under fire. Her decision to volunteer for the mission had been vindicated by her performance when it mattered most. The intelligence provided by the extracted asset would indeed prove crucial in preventing future attacks against American forces. 3 days later, Sarah received word that she was being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the mission. The citation would read, in part, "Lieutenant Commander Matthews's exceptional airmanship and courage under fire were directly responsible for the successful completion of a critical extraction mission in hostile territory. Her professional competence and dedication to mission accomplishment reflect the highest traditions of naval aviation." But for Sarah, the real reward was simpler and more meaningful. She had proven to herself, and to others, that courage and competence were not determined by gender or stereotypes, but by character and commitment. When Captain Morrison had called out asking for pilots willing to fly a dangerous mission, she had quietly risen to meet the challenge. In doing so, she had not only saved lives but had also opened doors for others who would follow in her footsteps. The SEALs who had initially greeted her volunteer status with skepticism now spoke of her with the same respect they reserved for their most trusted teammates. She had earned their confidence not through words or credentials, but through performance under the most demanding conditions imaginable. In the Brotherhood of Warriors, there was no higher honor. Years later, when young female aviators asked Sarah about breaking barriers in military aviation, she would always tell them the same thing. Preparation, professionalism, and performance were the only credentials that mattered when lives were on the line. Gender was irrelevant when measured against competence and courage. The mission had taught her that respect was earned through actions, not granted through policies or good intentions. The extracted asset provided intelligence that prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks over the following 6 months, potentially saving dozens of civilian lives. The success of the mission rippled outward in ways that could never be fully measured or quantified. But for the people whose lives were saved by that intelligence, and for the SEALs who had trusted Sarah to bring them home safely, the impact was both immediate and lasting. Sarah continued flying combat missions for another 4 years before accepting a position as a test pilot for new helicopter systems. Her experience with Special Operations Forces made her invaluable in developing and evaluating aircraft designed for similar high-risk missions. She retired from the Navy as a captain, having served with distinction for over 20 years. The helicopter she flew that night was eventually retired from service, but not before completing dozens of additional missions without losing a single crew member or passenger. The aircraft's service record stood as a testament to both superior engineering and the skill of the pilots who flew it into harm's way. Sarah's name was permanently associated with its most famous mission. Captain Morrison went on to command a larger special operations unit, but he never forgot the night when a quiet female pilot had volunteered for an impossible mission and then executed it flawlessly under fire. He made it a point to recommend qualified female personnel for challenging assignments, knowing that competence and courage were not limited by traditional expectations. The story of that mission became part of the unofficial history shared among special operations units, passed down from experienced operators to newer personnel as an example of what could be accomplished when skill, courage, and determination came together under pressure. Sarah's decision to rise quietly from her seat in that briefing room had changed not just her own career, but had also influenced the attitudes and expectations of an entire community of warriors. In the end, the mission succeeded because a pilot with the right skills and the right attitude had been in the right place at the right time. But it also succeeded because Sarah Matthews had made the conscious decision to step forward when others hesitated, accepting a challenge that would test everything she had learned about flying and about herself. Her quiet act of courage had spoken louder than any speech about equality or opportunity. The legacy of that night extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. It demonstrated that excellence in military aviation was determined by individual merit rather than demographic categories. For the generations of pilots who would follow, both male and female, Sarah's example proved that the only barriers that truly mattered were those imposed by lack of skill or absence of courage. Everything else was just noise that faded away when the mission began and lives hung in the balance.